And say no to the so-called abuse of sanctions. China's president takes a veiled swipe at US-led actions to punish Russia's invasion of Ukraine at a virtual meeting of major developing nations. Well, let's stay on that story. An influential group of emerging economies calling for talks between Russia and Ukraine. The appeal came as the BRICS nations conclude their virtual forum today. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa have been navigating major shifts in the geopolitical scene and worries on economic growth. Through the meeting, host Xi Jinping has been touting his alternative to the US-led global order. The Chinese president has heavily criticized global sanctions, and he's called on the BRICS to be more vocal to protect multilateralism. The sentiment was largely shared by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who also urged deeper ties between the nations. China, India and South Africa have abstained from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's get more from Lo Min. She joins us from Shanghai. Min, as you take us through President Xi's speech, what does it reveal about China's aim and agenda at the BRICS summit?
Well, I think we can see that President Xi is using this summit to put forward his vision of a new global world order at a time when both Russia and China are increasingly isolated by the West. And the timing of this summit is significant, happening just days ahead of two important summits coming up next week, the G7 summit happening this Sunday and the NATO summit happening next Wednesday. And Chinese state media has reported that Beijing is trying to use the BRICS to counterbalance the tendency for Western nations to form small cliques in the G7 and to provide an alternative and fair global governance system that is not dominated by American hegemony. Now, at the summit yesterday, the 5 countries agreed to deepen cooperation in areas like pandemic prevention, global economic recovery, safeguarding peace and security, and reforming global governance. And President Xi, appearing in a virtual summit alongside the leaders of 4 other large emerging nations at this time, is sending a symbolic message that China is not alone. These 5 countries combined, they comprise 40% of the world's population and 1/4 of the global GDP. And President Xi also said he welcomes like-minded partners to join the BRICS family, saying that new blood will inject new vitality and it would increase their representativeness and influence on the world stage. And he contrasted this open and inclusive nature of the BRICS mechanism to what he calls the creation of exclusive small circles by other countries, a comment that's clearly targeted at the US.
Is China's message expected to loom equally large at the upcoming G7 and NATO summits next week?
That's right. The G7 and NATO countries are likely to take a hard line against China following what they see as increasing economic and security threats by China. The G7 countries expected to discuss what they call coercive and unfair practices by China. And US officials have predicted that Beijing will be mentioned for the very first time in a new NATO policy framework that outlines their security challenges in the coming decade. And the NATO Secretary General has said that China poses a challenge to their values, security and interests. And for the first time, guest countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand are also invited to attend the summit, which is highly alarming for China. It shows that NATO is extending its reach far beyond the European continent, and President Xi had sharp words to say about that, warning against the expansion of military alliances. We know that China has been blaming the expansion of NATO for sparking the war in Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin had also pushed for the creation of an alternative international reserve currency at the BRICS meeting, made out of a basket of BRICS currency, and that's taken on greater urgency after Russia faced sanctions from the West that excluded it from the international SWIFT banking system. And according to Russian state media, this proposal is currently under review by the BRICS country.
As always, many thanks. Lo Min reporting from Shanghai.